You know, some people say change is inevitable, and those people are 100% right. Everything changes, everything grows, everything is in a constant state of like flux, I guess. And that also goes for trends. And trends also include doll trends. Hey, welcome to the Teeny Tinker channel. I make doll and craft related content. And sometimes, like this video, I like to do a nice little deep dive into doll history, doll trends, that kind of stuff, this kind of stuff. So come along with me. We are going to explore the changing trends of ball jointed dolls in the West over the last 30 years. All right, let's set the scene with the 90s. Realistically, this is going to be the extremely late 90s because not much was happening before then. That's because BJDs really didn't make their way over into like the West, into Western doll collector collections until really 1998, 1999. That was really when the very first bits of BJD collecting kind of started happening in Canada and the USA. Before this, it was predominantly something that was really taking place in Asia, predominantly like Japan, Korea, China. Although there wasn't a lot happening in the West at this time, I do want to kind of start here just so we have a baseline for how things evolved. In 1999, a company called Vokes introduced the Super Delphi line to its Asian market. This was really a significant milestone in the BJD world, which is why, even though they are technically not ball jointed in the sense that we consider ball jointed dolls today, they are still sort of grandfathered in and widely accepted because they kind of were the first of their kind. Super Delphis were highly customizable with the swappable parts, wigs, eyes that we love from ball jointed dolls even today. At this time, most ball jointed dolls, or BJDs, were ABJDs, or Asian ball jointed dolls. From what I understand, there was a huge emphasis in that community about these dolls basically being canvases for their owners. This was a trend that really differentiated ball jointed dolls from the mass-produced kind of dolls that kind of came as a package deal. Ball jointed dolls, as some of you may know, primarily come blank and unpainted, basically leaving all of the imagination and the work and the creativity to the collector. Although even today, that DIY part of ball jointed doll culture is still alive and well. Okay, so let's talk about what these dolls look like. At the end of the 90s, we were basically seeing the Super Delphis, so think anime-esque dolls. That was kind of a big thing at the very beginning. But once resin dolls started being introduced, we were seeing more kind of realistic proportions, sharp facial features, and very realistic human body shape. Another big thing is that ball jointed dolls being released were targeted specifically at adults, older teenagers maybe, but unlike pretty much every other doll, they were not marketed to children. To do that, they were released with more kind of mature themes in mind, and also, besides being quite realistic, also tended to lean towards very mature looking adults, which isn't something a lot of kids tend to gravitate to. They were also anatomically correct, so some parents might not be super into that. I don't know about the 90s, but I know that today there's definitely parents who kind of get in a huff about that kind of thing. But again, to set the stage for the 90s, there were trend aesthetics at play during this time, even if they were kind of the initial trends that were introduced. In the 90s, a lot of the items being made for dolls were more fantasy or more traditional. Now, I know those things kind of contradict each other, but when I say that, I kind of mean fantasy in the like medieval, elfy maybe type fantasy. And then in traditional, I mean really pulling from like Korean, Japanese, Chinese culture, basically wherever the doll was being made and what the sculptor was getting influence from. These cultural elements especially were really like a deep-rooted part of what made these dolls so special and what drew people to them initially. Now, another style trend we were seeing was the influence of like Japanese fashion, things like Lolita, Gothic Lolita, etc., where there was a lot of like dark colors and lace and like Victorian inspired elements, kind of like what I was saying with the fantasy theming as well, kind of just all tumbling together. But anyways, these trends that were kind of laid out in the 90s really set the stage, set the scene for how the trends were going to go over the next like 20 plus years. Okay, so after each decade, I want to take a quick moment and kind of just highlight some of the most iconic dolls from that time. So again, not a lot to work off for the 90s, but unsurprisingly, Vokes would probably be considered the most popular. Hello, we have arrived at the early 2000s, the Y2K era, if you will. Between the years of 2000 and 2010, BJD saw really rapid growth in diversity and in popularity. This was really a time of like advancements in how we were making BJDs, how accessible they were to people, and this really helped grow the ball jointed doll community in general, which is always fantastic. Something that really helped this along, obviously, was something else that was really big at the time: the internet. The internet really played a huge role in how big the ball jointed doll community got. Not just in the Western world, but globally. We saw things like eBay, marketplaces, and obviously online forums. All of these things kind of coming together really helped doll collectors find each other, spread the word, sell things to each other, swap tips, all of that great stuff. Around this time, most people in the Western world had internet of some kind in their house. Around this time, I was still chilling on dial-up. Anyone remember that noise? But I did have internet. Now, while I was buffering 3 YouTube videos at the same time for 10 minutes so I could go back and watch them, all the while my mom was yelling at me for hogging the phone line with the internet. Anyone remember that? Anyone else's parents? Other people, more mature people, were hanging out in online forums like Den of Angels. Den of Angels came about maybe early 2000s and really kind of became a hub for the community. At least that's my understanding. Again, I was busy watching Charlie the Unicorn.
It's a Leo Pleurodon, Charlie. Magical Leo Pleurodon.
So you'll have to let me know. Another thing that was really popular with collectors around this time was personal blogging. Collectors loved to document their doll journeys, their collection growth, how things changed over time, especially on platforms like LiveJournal, and then also things like Flickr or DeviantArt, where you could share like photography and just image sharing, all of that stuff. That was super duper popular within the Western BJD community at the time. Being able to showcase more and more beautiful photos of fully customized, super cool looking ball jointed dolls also really helped get the dolls in front of more people. Again, just grow in the community. Because now you weren't just reaching people on Den of Angels or on specific marketplaces, you were able to reach people all over Flickr and DeviantArt and all of that. So like I said, ball jointed dolls had already kind of started taking off in Asia in the 90s, but this was really when they kind of kicked off over here. So we really started seeing kind of like global cultural influence, and the clothing items and the styling and the hairstyles over here became less focused on what we were seeing coming from Asia and incorporating our own culture and style and pop culture, of course, into everything we made for our dolls, or the kinds of dolls we wanted, really. Okay, but that kind of covers what was happening trends-wise for like social and community, but like, what about the actual dolls? Following the success of Vokes and their Super Dollfie line, we really started to see more companies pop up, like Fairyland, Lutz, and Zoom were all like super popular during this time period. Each one of these brands / companies, although remember these companies are very, very, very small, they each had their own distinct style and brought something new into the ball jointed doll game. Obviously, this further expands the market and gives collectors a really wide variety to choose from and more kind of options for customization. Fairyland was a lot more delicate and ethereal, and then you had Zoom, which was more like fantasy driven. And there was a lot of customization information being shared during this time as well. The early 2000s really kind of let people share more advanced kind of customization techniques and spread them around so more people were able to get better at customizing or more efficient at customizing. I kind of liken this to how when I look back at my high school pictures or like my early high school pictures, my makeup was absolutely terrible, like all of the time. However, teenagers today don't have that problem because they can access endless makeup tutorials that we just kind of had to figure out. And yeah, it's very much like that. People were doing less trial and error and were able to find out what brands or what products to use, what techniques to use, which brush to use with what, how to get this certain look, all of these things. Of course, that doesn't mean that people were not like trying new things and expanding, quite the opposite, but it just meant that the average collector was able to kind of pick it up a lot easier than having to come in blind, which is what we were seeing before. We were now seeing more kinds of ways you could customize, even things like body modification, like intricate face-ups, and of course, custom clothing. Another thing we were seeing is kind of the start of hybriding, which is where you put some doll parts together, maybe like a head from this doll with this body and maybe these hands. Kind of awesome, actually. Okay, so let's also kind of touch on sizes here. So in the 90s, like I said, mostly stuff like Super Dolphy, we were seeing like a lot of like 1/3 scale in our sizing. And these like 60 centimeter dolls were kind of what was considered standard. But, you know, between 2000 and 2010, we really started seeing the introduction of like quarter scale, which is like 40, 45 centimeters, or MSD. And we also saw larger dolls, like half scale dolls, 70, 80, 90 centimeter tall. Towards the end of this time period, like towards 2008, 2009, Fairyland also started releasing like their 1/8 size, like their Pookie Fees and stuff, which also were crazy popular. And I mean, like, they're super cute, I get it. This scale diversity also really catered to people. If you didn't have a lot of space, you could now have tiny ball jointed dolls, or if you wanted to kind of fill out a room with dolls, or like hold something kind of like human sized. I don't know. I don't understand the big dolls myself, but people really liked having the choice. Obviously, having more choice ever a bad thing? Well, I guess if you're like me and you can get like decision paralysis, I guess, but that's not what this is about. Okay, as far as aesthetics, we were still seeing a lot of fantasy theming, but it was kind of really leaning more mythical fantasy rather than medieval fantasy. We were seeing companies like Zoom release dolls with like wings and horns, like very much like the dolls themselves could be creatures. These dolls also often came with backstories or were based off of a mythological creature or something, which like really also helped boost their popularity. This was also a really big moment for the emo dolls. I mean, I get it. I was an emo kid in this time period too. I mean, sometimes I think my dolls were born in the wrong generation. So gothic and punk kind of styles for dolls really became more mainstream than, honestly, when I was looking into this, I was like, oh, they were all emo. Like, oh my gosh, like, it was very cool. And I know some people look back and they'll be like, oh, the faux fur wigs. I'm like, man, that is exactly what scene kid hair looked like. Like, I remember, I was there. I had all the got to be glued going on too. Like yeah, it was super cool to look at the pictures and stuff and research this because I knew there were a lot of like emo and goth dolls, but I had no idea like how big this was. Like people being able to customize things easier themselves and a lot more custom clothing. We really started seeing like kind of more casual wear, like t-shirts and jeans being introduced as doll clothes instead of sort of like frilly dresses and like really tailored outfits like we might have seen before. Also, on top of this, around this time, dolls started coming out that were like limited edition, or they had like outfits or accessories that were exclusive to this doll, this specific release, and a lot of times were very quantity limited. like sometimes super quantity limited. This is kind of like when we start seeing the introduction of FOMO into the doll community. So yeah, like the Y2K period, really a time of huge expansion of the ball jointed doll community and of kind of taking on more fantasy, quirky type aesthetics and also more casual wear. That was kind of like the big moments of the 2000s. Oh, and obviously huge growth in community with access to the internet and all of that good stuff. All right, so most iconic dolls of 2000 to 2010. Okay, we're gonna take a quick cliff note here and say that assume that Vokes and Lutz are always popular for like all of these because they are. So I'm not gonna call them out every single time. Some of the most popular dolls of this time were basically the entire Dollmore model doll line. Like the whole doll line did pretty well. And I think the Zoom Super Gems, who were released in 2006, also did pretty well. I also wanted to add a little cliff note as an editor that Custom House Little Jr., Elf Doll Red, Eipel House Asa, Dollmore Liv, and Zoom Dia were all popular sculpts for this time. Okay, so 2010 to 2020, we really saw a shift to hyper-realism towards like the beginning of 2010. We had our company dolls, but we were also seeing a lot of like independent artist dolls. Even outside of Asia, we were starting to see more like Western artists or like European artists. And there really was a strong push towards hyper-realistic, either full dolls or features. A lot of the dolls from this period were like obviously beautiful, but could almost pass as real people sometimes, like really, really cool. So we were really seeing like a lot more like smaller heads, bigger feet sometimes, but just really realistic body and face proportions. Along with this hyper-realism trend, we were seeing a lot more advancements in things like body blushing. Hand blushing became a lot more popular with people like painting their dolls' nails, but not just in a I put nail polish on the doll, not actual nail polish paint. Please don't put nail polish on your doll. But in the, oh, and I gave them cuticles, and oh, there's a hangnail, and like the tiny creases of your finger joints, like that, like those details were being put onto the doll either via sculpting or via paint. We started seeing artists use more technologies, things like airbrushing. This time was also the decade of diversity. There was like huge demand for dolls, like especially with how realistic they look. People wanted to kind of see themselves or like people they knew or like celebrities, whatever, kind of represented as dolls. The companies and independent artists started making a much wider, like diverse type of doll line. You could get dolls where the sculpting more closely represented like Latina, African, like all kinds of huge range of cultures outside of what we had really seen before, which was East Asian and white. That was basically all that was being made, with exceptions, and obviously like elves. So, you know, not only in sculpt, but also companies started offering like a wider range of color or more interesting colors instead of just like white, peach, and sometimes gray, or like mid tan, which was not very dark, as it was like me. Like this was the tan in question. We were seeing more colors, more like diversity in sculpts, but we were also seeing like the introduction of things like disability aids or like chubbier dolls, like to really like lean into the body positivity movement, and that not every doll needed to be like super skinny, which is very cool. We also started getting a lot more like muscular dolls, again, super cool. This is also the time where we saw a lot of advancements in doll making technology. Prior to this, most dolls were made via like some kind of clay, by hand, and then hand cast in silicone, like to make molds, and then obviously cast in the resin and like hand sanded and all of this. And there's a lot of artists who still make their dolls that way, and that is super cool. But there has been a definite, like during the last 10 years, like 2010 to 2020, we started seeing the introduction of things like 3D printing. Even before resin printing, there was like PLA printing, and people started having access to those tools and being able to sculpt things digitally in like animation programs like Blender. Earlier in that decade, these things were very, very, very expensive comparatively to how they are today. However, having this technology where you didn't have to wait for clay to dry or to bake or to ship things off in the same way, it really helped speed up a lot of production times. And we mostly stopped seeing dolls take 2 years sometimes, and 6 to 12 months kind of became the norm during this time, which is like a win. 2010 to 2020 also became like kind of like the really big push in the West for having good doll markets. Now, this secondary doll market kind of popped off in a weird way, where people having these limited edition dolls were then able to kind of, if they decided they didn't like it, or if they were feeling opportunistic sometimes, they were able to then sell these limited edition dolls for much more than they had paid for them. This sometimes caused and still causes an inflation in the value of dolls, but that's just like, that's how fair market works, I guess. Oh, something else we kind of saw around this time is platforms like Kickstarter being used to kind of get small independent artists going. Now, I don't see a lot of this anymore in the BJD world, but it was a thing for a little while where a doll artist would sculpt something, and if people wanted it, they would host a Kickstarter, and then that would help them fund their first dolls. Okay, so for aesthetics, fantasy continues to be popular. What that fantasy is does change, but besides that, 2010, 2020, we're starting to see like cyberpunk themes, like robots. We're starting to see like cyborgs. Sometimes things like aliens. Sometimes things with like super futuristic outfits. Like there's a bunch of that kind of stuff. I feel like there's some pretty cool examples of these if you want. And again, around this time, J fashion really pops off, and people start seeing a lot more like kawaii, cutesy style things, like magical girl kind of dolls. We're also starting to see a lot more like sweet Lolita, like if you think of like doll hearts, like that kind of thing. A lot of frills, like cutesy type things, like traditionally like doll-esque type things, but like super detailed and cute. Around this time, we're also seeing a lot of steampunk, which again, like it's like all the coolest stuff was happening. Like, I don't know, this is like some cool stuff. This is around the time I joined the hobby. And yeah, I remember the steampunk. I remember the sweet Lolita. I remember all of that. Yeah, anyways, I really like the steampunk thing. I thought that was very epic. And the amount of detail that went into some of these accessories, like, amazing. Another thing that became super popular as far as doll releases and styling was making dolls based off of like popular anime or movies or things like that. These were even released sometimes by companies who would make like collaboration dolls. I think Vokes is one of these that does like collaboration dolls. And those are always popular. They're always like limited edition. People love them. Ooh, also, very awesomely, around this time, the BJD community started kind of taking some notice on like, you know, things like global warming and stuff, and like a push towards sustainability became like a lot more common. We started seeing more things made in like eco resin, more like compostable or biodegradable packaging, things like that, like a lot more paper being used over plastic. Okay, so we also talked about the use of social media like Flickr, DeviantArt, LiveJournal, that kind of stuff, to kind of build community and document like what people were doing with their dolls and like find other like-minded people. So this trend stays true, where people obviously want community spaces, but you know, the platforms themselves change. We obviously see a lot more things like Instagram and YouTube really getting popular during that time. And the doll content creators, I feel like 2010 to 2020 was like the heyday for ball jointed doll YouTube. Like, I feel like there's really not very many ball jointed doll YouTubers anymore. Heyo. But there was a lot. Like, a lot of times when I look at the videos under the ball jointed doll, like if you search for them, a lot of the videos are from the 2010 to 2020 period, with a lot less creators putting out videos after, you know, the turn of the decade. But, you know, sad day, but it was really popping off at the time, okay? I also think that this was really a really good time for building community, because YouTube and Instagram were a lot more like interpersonal in the way that you had to like follow somebody and you could like discover their content, but then you could follow them and then like almost build like, well, you could actually build friendships, but you could feel like you got to know people's collections or like watch artists as they made dolls or any of that stuff. I feel like it really created like a more tight-knitness in a lot of aspects for the community. I think the only other thing I would say really became like, I think was a really big trend was dioramas and like the miniatures and the dollhouse community. I feel like two communities collided. I think more BJD collectors were seeing things like Square to Spare would be a modern example. I don't know if they were posting back then, but there was a lot of like miniaturists and all of that who were kind of like making things for ball jointed dolls. We saw a lot more things becoming available on platforms like Etsy. We saw a lot more tutorials on how to make these things. And a lot more people making dioramas and room boxes and stuff for their dolls. The icons of 2010 to 2020. I think you can't talk about popular dolls from this time period without mentioning Dollshi. And while they are quite controversial now because of their frankly scammy behavior, at the time, Dollshi Saint and Dollshi Hound were extremely popular. Then, of course, we had Minifee Chloe released in 2011. I feel like Minifee Chloe is still super beloved, so. We also have the Dollmaster series, and I watched the Dollmaster. It's a Korean horror film centered around ball jointed dolls. I watched and reacted to it on this channel like a billion years ago, but Custom House had a full doll line for that movie. Okay, so we are going to touch a little bit on like 2020 to present. We don't have a whole decade to talk about, obviously, because it's only been 4 years. But before we get into that, let's just take a quick break because it is time for Doll of the Week. This week's Doll of the Week comes from Instagram user Tappy Diary, who shared this really adorable photo of their Soda Pop version 1. They've also got some of the little itty bitty micro dolls that they've pictured. And here's just an older photo for good measure, but thank you so much, Tappy Diary, for sharing your photos and for always sharing your girl. All right, if you want to be featured for Doll of the Week, you can post on Instagram using hashtag TeenyTinkersDolls, but please also tag me. You can also join my Discord, which is linked down below, and you can post on there as well. All right, that's enough. Let's get back to the video. Okay, so here we are, 2020 to present. You know, the BJD community has really continued to evolve. And it's been evolving despite, you know, global events, technological advancements, and like all the different cultural trends. The 2019, 2020, 2021, 2020, the pandemic, people kind of spending more time in their own homes, kind of brought more online activity into the BJD community as people were like looking for a way to connect with other people or pass the time. More people found the hobby. Like, I had stepped into the hobby a little bit, like 2019, 2018, but 2020, like after like lockdown and stuff, during lockdown is really when collecting dolls at the time really took off for me, and it was true for a lot of people. A lot of the physical conventions and meetups kind of became online things in Zoom, and that made it more accessible to more people, which again helped grow the community and who was getting involved and what everyone was doing, and in a way kind of leveled the playing field a little bit more. I do find that in the last few years, especially, there has been kind of more of a push towards buying secondhand dolls. Although the impact of this is kind of that in the opposite of what was happening like before, is with so many dolls in the marketplace, it does tend to bring the secondhand market value of dolls down. So it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, it's a buyer's market versus a seller's market right now. So if you want to buy dolls, you can use the secondhand market and you can probably get a really good deal. However, you know, Instagram did kind of kill the Instagram secondhand market by ruining hashtags. I don't know what... I mean, they probably saved a bunch of people's wallets, but yeah. There's still a lot of activity happening on Facebook, though, where people are buying and selling secondhand dolls there. If you're not part of any of those groups, there's a ton of them. Just search BJD buy sell. You're going to find a ton of them. I would also say in the last few years, I've definitely seen a bigger push towards diversity and different kinds of dolls. Versus, I think when I first started in the hobby, like this is anecdotal, but it's also kind of backed up by like my research. There's a lot more like minifee-esque dolls. Like you had anime dolls and like kind of minifees, and that doesn't mean every doll was a minifee, obviously, but kind of in that traditional ball jointed doll look or like slightly anime cutesy. But in the last few years, we've definitely seen a bigger push for diversity in dolls, and that means, again, different skin tones, different sculpts, but also like just a broadening of what is a ball jointed doll and what constitutes one, as far as like what we're thinking of like sculpting wise. Like things are kind of getting wild and outside the box. At least I am. It's like really something that I've leaned into, but it is generally a trend. I'm seeing a lot more different types of dolls and like kind of pushing the boundaries on like stylization and like how limbs move, trying out new engineering things. Now, there are definitely some people who don't like this and kind of want things to stay how they're saying. The same kinds of people who think that you have to sculpt a doll with clay for it to be like a valid doll. There's always going to be people who resist change in that way, and it just is what it is. But the trends are definitely like leaning towards a really big diversity in dolls, I think. So also seeing a lot more things like centaurs, mermaids, anthropomorphic dolls. We got some friends here. We got some object heads, some anthro dolls. Like it's a thing. It's very fun. People are really kind of getting creative, and it's awesome. The last few years have also brought like a really huge DIY component to like what everyone's like making and doing. We're seeing a lot more people like try sewing for the first time or try doing their own face ups. And I think part of that is obviously access to information and like this explosion in like creativity and trying new things. I think is maybe like it's at least an earmark, I think, for the last 4 years of this hobby. I think all of this though is really helped by the fact that 3D printing is super accessible at this point. If you have a space and proper ventilation, please people, proper ventilation and safety equipment, you can print things. Even if you can't sculpt, you can find like free files on Thingiverse, not necessarily for like dolls all the time, but for like accessories or like add-on parts, stuff like that. So that's been super cool to kind of like witness and be part of. And then there was like a weird blip in time where NFTs had kind of like infiltrated the BJD space during the last few years. That was a weird time. As far as like doll clothes styles, I think in the last 4 years, I've seen a lot more things like athleisure. Like you see a lot of like leggings and crop hoodie sets. I also think the last 4 years have really kind of brought us some really like great footwear. I think footwear is something that for the longest time, we all basically just accepted that it was like lace-up boots or like penny loafers. And that was like 99% of our shoes. But in the last 4 years, like the realistic like sneakers and like little Doc Martens and like, oh my gosh, it's so cute. Like I cannot deal with how fun the footwear is becoming. I've been trying to like make some myself. I've made a few I haven't kept all of them because, you know, they don't turn out great all the time, but it's really fun to experiment and try and make miniatures of the versions of the footwear I'd like, and I'm seeing other people do that, and I'm seeing companies, even like the doll clothing companies, have caught on and are making things outside of like Converse, Lolita shoes, and lace-up boots. Like, it's very cool. Icon time. It's only been 4 years, so like this rundown is going to be a lot like more of a condensed period of time, but I tried to pick out some dolls that I think are quite popular in the last couple of years anyways. So of course there's minifees on this list. We have minifee Celine, Sia, and Chloe still, you know, 10 years later, Chloe is still killing it. Also really popular from Fairyland were the Feeple 60, Rendia, and Rhea. Ring Dolls Sol is quite popular, or Soul, I'm not sure, it's S-O-L. Then kind of in like the weird little friends-ish vibe, we have Doll Chateau Ada and Doll Zone Carter. Really well known for being super unique, but like very, very, very well loved, I think. All right, we can't talk about popular dolls from this period without mentioning Switch, Soil Rock, and Huisa. I'll also say I think Resin Soul has had quite a moment the last few years, especially Bao and May. They are quite cute and while being quite affordable. All right, so keep in mind that just now and then in all the dolls I've listed in the iconic dolls of this time, I'm basically keeping it to company dolls, and that was just basically for what was easiest, honestly. But if you'd like me to look into most popular artist dolls from the last like 20 years, let me know. I think that would be really fun. It's kind of difficult. I'd have to do a lot of like Den of Angels digging and like I'd have to do a lot of digging, but I think it would be a lot of fun to look into and research, so let me know what you think. But yeah, that basically brings us up to date, but the conversation's not over yet. Next week on Unhinged, a doll collector podcast, we're going to be chit-chatting with Kit and Kat Doll Shop, and the conversation is all about predicting the future of doll making. And I hope you guys like it. I thought this was a kind of a fun video to have before that video. Kind of like explore history from then until today. And then next week, or, you know, maybe right now, if it's a week later and you're watching this video, you can now go ahead and see what we think is going to happen next. Thanks so much for popping in and watching this video. If there were trends in here I didn't talk about, or if you feel like I was mistaken on a trend, especially like before I joined the hobby, please correct me. I am but one person doing but one person's research. And especially if you've been here like in the hobby for like 2 decades, you'll have a lot more knowledge on this than I have, and I would love to hear your thoughts below. For now, that is this video. If you're already subscribed, thanks so much for subscribing, and if you're new here, I hope you like the content and consider subscribing. As always, I hope you have a fantastic day.